The market air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and damp stone. Artyom shoved past a merchant, his boots skidding on the uneven cobbles. He did not look back. He did not slow down. His head snapped from side to side, eyes scouring the faces of every passerby, searching for a specific set of features that remained stubbornly absent. A wooden cart piled high with cabbages swerved into his path, forcing him to hurdle a crate and crash into a stack of baskets. He scrambled up, ignoring the shouts of the stall owner, and plunged back into the sea of bodies. The crowd was a wall of shifting shoulders and murmuring voices, a blur of movement that offered no clarity. He checked his surroundings again, desperation tightening his chest. The manga had mapped every inch of this city, but here the streets felt alien and unscripted. He pushed into a narrow alleyway, his breath coming in jagged bursts. Every face he scanned was a stranger, every shadow held nothing but empty space. He was hunting a ghost in a reality that refused to align with his memory. He stopped at the alley mouth, hands braced against a cold brick wall, and looked out at the churning chaos of the market once more. Nothing. The target was nowhere to be found. Artyom slammed his fist against the brick, the vibration traveling up his arm. He needed an anchor. He needed the system to validate the path. "Identify him!" he hissed, his voice cracking under the roar of the market. Tall, lean, a jagged scar on his chin. "Find him!" He waited, jaw tight, expecting the familiar glow of a quest marker to slice through the ambient light. Instead, the air remained stagnant. The system pulsed once, a dull, rhythmic flicker of light in his vision. Processing, the voice echoed in his mind, devoid of any urgency. Match found for 47 individuals within 300 meters. Artyom staggered back, his vision blurring. 47. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. He shouted again, louder, drawing stares from the passing traders. "That is not a lead. Filter by the aura. Filter by the sword style." The system hummed, a low mechanical drone that sounded like a mockery of his panic. Criteria insufficient. No unique signature detected matching current parameters. He grabbed his own hair, pulling until his scalp burned. The crowd swirled around him, indifferent to his breakdown. Every face he looked at was a failure. The system was no longer a navigator. It was a wall. He stood in the center of the market, surrounded by 47 ghosts and no way to tell which one was real. Artyom wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a trembling hand. He had to be precise. He focused his intent on the memory of the target, projecting the image of the facial mark with desperate clarity. "Focus on the scar," he commanded, his voice barely a rasp. "The jagged line on the chin. That is the identifier. Search for that." The system flickered, its light turning a cold, sterile blue. It processed for a long moment, the silence between them stretching into a heavy, suffocating weight. "Error," the interface replied, the text appearing in sharp, unyielding lines in his field of vision. "That scar appears 2 years after the event you already prevented." Artyom froze. The market noise seemed to drop away, replaced by the rhythmic thudding of his own heart. He stared at the empty space before him, his fingers digging into his palms. He had changed the past. He had altered the sequence of events so thoroughly that the clues he once trusted were now ghosts of a timeline that no longer existed. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was not just lost. He was chasing a version of reality that he had personally destroyed. The system remained silent, offering no guidance to fix the mess he had created. He stood motionless, watching the crowd drift by, suddenly aware that every step he took forward was walking into a future he could no longer predict. The market noise faded as Artyom ducked into the shadows of a narrow alleyway. He followed a hunch, a desperate need for something tangible amidst the wreckage of his predictions. The smell of wet stone and rotting grain hit him first, thick and suffocating. He moved deeper, his boots scraping against loose debris. At the end of the passage, tucked behind a pile of discarded wooden crates, a figure moved. Artyom halted. He squinted through the gloom, expecting the imposing presence of a warrior, the aura of a man who would eventually command respect. Instead, he saw a boy. He was shivering, knees pulled tightly to his chest, arms wrapped around himself to hold in the warmth. The boy looked up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He was 16, perhaps younger, his eyes darting toward the exit with blatant, unrefined fear. There was no sword, no iron-willed stance, no presence of a master. Artyom felt the air leave his lungs. He had spent hours hunting a titan, only to find a child hiding from the world. The reality of the situation pinned him to the spot. The boy before him was not a legend. He was just a terrified youth, and the gap between the myth and the shivering boy in the mud was wide enough to swallow Artyom whole. Artyom loomed over the alley, his gaze fixed on the boy who was supposed to become a legend. Every fiber of his training insisted this child was a master in the making, yet the evidence screamed otherwise. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the boy's trembling shoulder, then pulled back, unsure if contact would shatter the last of his delusions. "Lin Shao," he whispered, the name feeling like a lead weight on his tongue. The boy blinked, his head tilting with a raw, unscripted curiosity that lacked any trace of the cold, calculated discipline of a warrior. Artyom closed his eyes, reciting the famous lines that had defined the character in the manga, the ironclad oath, the promise of vengeance. He opened his eyes and spat the words into the damp air. The boy simply stared, his jaw dropping in genuine bewilderment. There was no recognition, no spark of latent power, no hidden depth. Just a terrified teenager, trapped in a reality that refused to adhere to the plot. The manga had lied, or perhaps worse, the world had moved on without waiting for the script. Artyom felt the cold sweat of panic prickle his neck. He had spent his life preparing for a sword master, only to find a child who did not even know the path he was destined to walk. Artyom could not wait for the boy to become the hero. He had to build him. The silence between them grew heavy, filled only by the distant, muffled sounds of the market above. Artyom lunged forward, closing the distance in a single stride. He gripped the boy by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of the boy's shirt. He felt the sharp, bony ridge of the shoulder blade through his palm. The boy flinched, his body tensing under the unexpected pressure, but Artyom did not let go. He leaned in, his face inches from the boy's. "Listen to me," Artyom hissed, his voice raw with a manic urgency. "You are not staying here to rot in the mud." He shoved the boy slightly, forcing him to stand, to face the reality of the path ahead. Artyom pointed toward the northern horizon, toward the jagged, snow-dusted silhouette of the Jade Peak. "You must go there, now. The artifact is waiting at the summit. It is the only thing that can save you, the only thing that can make you what you are meant to be." He pushed the boy again, harder this time, steering him toward the alley exit. The command was absolute. A heavy stone dropped into a quiet pool, ripples of chaos starting to spread. The command hung in the air, but the expected spark of resolve never ignited. Instead, the boy recoiled as if burned. He scrambled backward, his heels scraping against the rough stones of the alley until his back hit the cold brick wall. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating until the irises were mere slivers of dark color. He shook his head violently, his breath hitching in sharp, ragged gasps. "The Jade Peak?" the boy whispered, the words trembling. "That is the White Tiger Sect territory." "Are you insane?" He pressed his palms against the wall, his knuckles white, his entire frame vibrating with a primal, unadulterated terror. Artyom stood frozen. In every page of the manga, the hero had marched toward that mountain with his head held high, his blade already drawn, never once questioning the danger or the cost. Seeing this version of the boy shivering, sweating, and openly begging for a way out felt like a physical blow to Artyom's chest. The legendary sword master was nowhere to be found. In his place was a terrified child who saw death where Artyom had promised destiny. The script was not just failing. It was being rewritten in real time by the boy's own panic. Artyom blinked, waiting for the system to correct the boy. He waited for the familiar chime, the glowing text that would lock the boy into the predetermined path. Silence. Only the sound of a distant merchant cart rattling over cobblestones reached him. Artyom tapped the air, calling up the interface. A translucent screen flickered into existence before his eyes, but the text was glitching, the characters folding in on themselves like burning paper. He tried to force a dialogue prompt, a narrative command to guide the boy toward the mountain, but the system pulses grew erratic, turning a sickly, dim amber. There was no prompt. There was no script. The boy was still huddled there, watching Artyom with wide, confused eyes, waiting for a leader who was currently losing his grip on reality. Artyom reached out to grab the interface, his fingers passing through the shimmering light as if it were nothing more than mist. The ground beneath him felt less solid, the certainty of the world he knew dissolving into a terrifying blank void. He had spent his life memorizing every turn of the page, but the page was blank now. He was no longer the architect of the story. He was just a man stumbling through a dark room, and for the first time, he realized he had no idea what was coming next. Artyom pulled his gaze away from the boy. He needed order. He needed the familiar hum of the system confirming his existence. If the grand narrative had shattered, he would rebuild his security from the ground up, one point at a time. He stepped out of the alley and into the chaotic flow of the market, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's focus. He ignored the boy, ignored the mountain, and looked for the mundane. A woman dropped a basket of apples. Artyom didn't blink. He watched the fruit roll, calculated the trajectory, and waited for the system to register his prediction. The interface pulsed a steady, cool blue. He saw a child chasing a stray dog toward a puddle and braced himself. He whispered the outcome to the empty air, testing the boundaries of this reality. The system pinged, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the noise of the market. A small digit appeared in the corner of his vision. He ignored the pity he felt for his own desperation and focused on the math. If he could not guide heroes, he would at least master the clockwork of the streets. Every small, predictable event became a lifeline. He was no longer a protagonist. He was a gambler, and the world was finally showing him its hand. Artyom moved deeper into the market, where the air grew thick with the smell of brine and damp wood. He stopped near a wooden stall piled high with silver-scaled fish. A fishmonger with thick, calloused hands was busy gutting a catch, his blade slicing through the scales with rhythmic thuds. A neighbor, carrying a heavy sack of grain, approached the stall with a scowl. Artyom narrowed his eyes, tracking the neighbor's heavy step and the fishmonger's irritable posture. He knew the pattern. He whispered the exact phrase before the neighbor could open his mouth. "You weigh the fish with the ice? You thief!" The neighbor's voice cracked exactly as predicted. The fishmonger roared back, slamming his knife onto the cutting board, just as Artyom had foreseen. The system chimed instantly, a sharp, cold sound that felt entirely disconnected from the raw, human anger unfolding before him. A cascade of points scrolled across his vision, a meaningless tally of numbers. He had won the gamble, but the victory felt hollow, like counting coins in a graveyard. He watched the two men shove each other, their faces red with genuine, spontaneous rage. While he stood motionless, a spectator trapped in a game where the rewards no longer matched the stakes of the world around him. The market noise began to grate on his nerves, a discordant symphony of human chaos. Artyom looked upward, ignoring the merchants and the bickering, focusing instead on the heavy, bruised purple of the clouds gathering over the rooftops. He felt the air pressure drop, a subtle shift that made his ears pop. He tracked the movement of the wind, the way the stray dogs suddenly tucked their tails and sought cover beneath wooden carts. He knew this sequence. He had memorized the weather patterns of this chapter until they were burned into his mind. He muttered the time, his voice a low, steady count. 3, 2, 1. The first heavy drop hit the dusty ground, kicking up a scent of dry earth and impending deluge. Within a heartbeat, the sky opened. Rain hammered against the market stalls, turning the paths into slick, gray mud. The crowd scattered, shouting in surprise as the sudden downpour caught them unprepared. Artyom stood perfectly still, letting the water soak into his skin. The system interface flared, a bright, triumphant gold in his peripheral vision. A steady stream of points flooded his account, a reward for his accuracy. For a fleeting moment, the cold logic of the world felt solid again. He breathed in the damp air, his pulse steadying. He could still read this world. The script was not entirely gone. Artyom pivoted toward the boy, his mind already cycling through the dialogue trees he had memorized years ago. He watched Lin Xiao lean against a damp stone wall, the boy's eyes fixed on the retreating rain clouds. This was the moment. In the original story, Lin Xiao would offer a specific, introspective reflection on the storm. Artyom narrowed his eyes, waiting for the trigger. He leaned in, his voice hushed and expectant. "The weather is an omen, isn't it?" he prompted, his thumb hovering over the interface to claim the points. He waited for the reply. Nothing. Lin Xiao didn't blink. He simply wiped a stray drop of water from his cheek and shifted his weight, his gaze remaining locked on the horizon. Artyom tried again, louder this time, feeding the boy the exact opening line of the scripted sequence. "You believe the path ahead is clear?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. The boy's jaw remained set, his lips a thin, stubborn line of resistance. Artyom felt a prickle of cold sweat at the base of his neck. The system's progress bar, usually a blur of activity, sat frozen and empty. He had offered the cue, but the response was nowhere to be found. The boy was not a static record to be played back. He was a wall, impenetrable and silent. Artyom refused to accept the silence. He tried again, his tone sharp, reciting the exact question from the text. "The sword is a burden, is it not?" Lin Xiao merely looked at him, his expression unreadable, and turned away. The system pulsed a warning, a jagged red line cutting across Artyom's vision. He scrambled, trying a different anchor point. "The past is a graveyard, and we are its ghosts." He spoke the lines with desperate precision. Still, nothing. The boy kicked a loose stone across the alley, his eyes fixed on the ground. A second red pulse flared, brighter than the first. Artyom grabbed the boy's arm, his fingers tightening in frustration. "You are supposed to say that the steel knows the truth," he hissed, desperation clawing at his throat. The system emitted a low-frequency hum that vibrated in Artyom's teeth. The interface screen flickered, text scrolling in a frantic, corrupted loop. The third failure hit with the force of a physical blow. The system's interface did not just pulse. It shrieked, a high-pitched static that forced Artyom to cover his ears. The predictive data he had relied on for months was dissolving into nonsense. He looked at the boy, then at the dying text in his vision. The boy was not a data point. The boy was breathing, thinking, and refusing to play along. The static subsided, leaving behind a hollow, ringing silence that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. Artyom's vision cleared, the frantic flickering replaced by a single, icy line of text hovering in the center of his view. It was not a quest notification or a point tally. It was a cold, clinical observation that hit him with the weight of a physical blow. Living people do not follow scripts. The words burned against his retinas. Artyom felt the ground beneath his boots shift, the familiar certainty of his knowledge dissolving like mist. For months, he had treated the world as a sequence of prompts and rewards, a game where he held the cheat sheet. Now, the logic had abandoned him. He looked at the boy standing a few paces away, who was currently occupied with brushing dust off his sleeves, completely unaware of the digital catastrophe unfolding in Artyom's mind. A wave of existential dread washed over him. If the boy could choose his own words, then the entire timeline he had memorized was not a map, it was a fragile, shifting suggestion. Artyom clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He had spent his life chasing a ghost, only to realize the world he stood in was far more dangerous and far more unpredictable than the manga had ever dared to show. Artyom let out a long, ragged breath that rattled in his chest. He flicked his wrist, a sharp motion, and the glowing red text in his vision vanished. The system flared once more, a faint, desperate pulse at the edge of his sight, but he refused to look. He did not need the blinking notifications to tell him what was coming next. He looked at the boy. Lin Xiao was shifting his weight, watching a stray dog trot across the alley, entirely unconcerned with destiny or narrative arcs. Artyom leaned against the damp stone wall and felt the cold seep into his back. He had been looking for a protagonist, but he was standing next to a person. The realization did not bring peace, but it brought clarity. He stopped analyzing the boy's micro-expressions for hidden plot triggers. He stopped calculating the point value of their interaction. He simply watched the boy's chest rise and fall with every steady breath. The digital noise that had defined his existence for months faded into the background. For the first time since his arrival, The world did not feel like a sequence of obstacles to be cleared. It felt like a vast, unwritten space. Artyom pushed himself off the wall and took a step toward the boy, ready to listen instead of predict. The marketplace was a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors and clattering wooden carts. Artyom moved through the throng, his steps measured, no longer hunting for plot points, but simply navigating the press of bodies. Lin Xiao trailed a few paces behind, his eyes darting toward the smell of roasting meat. The noise was relentless, a constant thrumming against the ears, until a sudden commotion near a grain stall drew their focus. A heavy sack had split, spilling dry, golden wheat across the uneven cobblestones. An elderly merchant groaned, clutching his lower back, clearly overwhelmed by the task of recovering his livelihood before the trampling feet of the crowd destroyed it. Before the merchant could even sink to his knees, a man stepped out from the passing flow of people. He did not hesitate. He dropped his own basket, knelt into the spilled grit, and began scooping the grain back into the jute with rhythmic, practiced efficiency. He worked with a quiet, steady focus, ignoring the impatient shoves of those trying to pass. When the merchant offered a shaky word of gratitude, the man simply smiled, a genuine, crinkling warmth that seemed to cut through the gray dust of the street. He laughed softly, patted the old man on the shoulder, and continued to help until the last handful was reclaimed. It was a small, unprompted act of grace, entirely disconnected from any quest or reward. Artyom felt the air vanish from his lungs. He stood frozen, his gaze locked onto the stranger's profile as if the man were a serpent coiled in the grass. He knew that face. He had seen it in every nightmare, printed on every lore scroll, and etched into the darkest chapters of the history books he had memorized. This was Chen Guang, the man who would eventually burn 3 great sects to the ground. The man whose name alone was a death sentence for thousands. Artyom's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that drowned out the market noise. He searched for the cruelty he expected to find, the coldness, the arrogance, the jagged edge of a mass murderer in the making, but saw only the dirt under the man's fingernails and the dust on his brow. The system pulsed in his periphery, a cold, clinical light that matched the icy spike of dread in his stomach. The identification was absolute. There was no glitch in the data, no error in the recognition. This was the monster, standing in the sunlight, tending to the needs of a stranger. Artyom's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. The contradiction was a physical blow, a violent collision between the villain he knew and the human being currently standing before him. He could not reconcile the two, and the resulting vertigo threatened to drop him to his knees right there in the path of the oblivious crowd. Chen Guang stood, dusting the dry earth from his palms. He did not leave. Instead, he reached into a small satchel at his side and pulled out a plain, wrapped parcel of flatbread. A beggar, hunched in the shadow of a nearby stall, watched him with hollow, desperate eyes. Chen Guang approached the man, lowered himself to a squat, and placed the food directly into the beggar's trembling hands. He spoke a few words, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient din a low, melodic sound that lacked any trace of malice. A small group of children, emboldened by the stranger's calm, darted forward. Chen Guang laughed. It was a bright, infectious sound, the kind that drew people in rather than driving them away. He ruffled the hair of the smallest child, handed out the remaining pieces of his own meal, and engaged in a playful, light-hearted exchange that lasted several minutes. Artyom watched from the edge of the alley, his stomach twisting. The man's face was soft, lined with genuine humor, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he teased the children. There was no shadow of the butcher who would eventually raise 3 great sects. There was only a man sharing what little he had with those who possessed even less. Every laugh from Chen Guang felt like a strike against Artyom's sanity, a betrayal of everything he believed he understood about the world he had fallen into. Artyom blinked, trying to scrub the image of the laughing man from his mind, but the vision remained burned into his retinas. He felt a sharp, ringing pressure behind his eyes. His fingers dug into the rough brick of the alley wall, seeking stability, but the ground beneath his boots felt suddenly porous and unreliable. The villain he knew from the pages of the manga was a static construct of absolute evil, a force of nature defined by his cruelty. This man was fluid, breathing, and fundamentally decent. Artyom whispered to the void. System. Analyze the target. Identify the deviation. The interface flickered, displaying a string of green text that offered no comfort. Target identity confirmed. Probability of future transition to primary antagonist status, 99.8%. The numbers offered no explanation for the man's current kindness. Artyom felt a cold shiver trace his spine as the truth settled in. The timeline was not a finished painting. It was a living, breathing landscape that had not yet reached its final, horrific shape. Chen Guang was not a villain yet. He was simply a man, walking through a world that had not yet broken him into the monster of legend. The realization arrived with the weight of a physical blow to his chest, knocking the air from his lungs and rendering every prediction he had made about this world obsolete. He was not just a narrator of a story. He was standing in the middle of a tragedy waiting to happen. The market noise hummed around him, a chaotic rhythm of life that no longer matched the static pages in his memory. Artyom stood frozen, his eyes tracing the movements of the crowd. He looked for archetypes, the hero, the merchant, the villain, but saw only people. He tapped his temple, calling for the system's guidance, desperate for the familiar, rigid logic of his source material. The interface pulsed, casting a pale light against his palm. Query: is this the prologue? The system's text shimmered, slow and indifferent. Characters existed long before the manga events began. Their trajectories are not fixed data points. Artyom let out a jagged breath. He had been treating the world like a pre-recorded play, waiting for cues that were never meant to be scripted. He watched a woman haggling over produce, her frustration sharp and authentic, and understood that her life was not a plot device. Every person he passed had a history that the manga never bothered to record. His interference was not correcting a narrative. It was disrupting a fragile, organic existence. The realization left him feeling exposed, a trespasser in a reality that refused to be managed. He was not just rewriting a story, he was actively dismantling the lives of thousands of people who were never meant to be pawns in his quest for survival. Artyom turned away from the market, his thoughts still anchored to the heavy truth of his own interference. He did not hear the footsteps at first, soft and deliberate on the packed dirt. A shadow fell across his path. He looked up to find Lin Xiao standing only a few paces away. The boy was no longer huddled or glancing nervously at the surrounding buildings. The tremor in his hands had vanished. His jaw was set, and his eyes held a cold, piercing clarity that made Artyom take an involuntary step back. Lin Xiao did not flinch. He walked forward, closing the distance until the air between them felt tight. The boy's voice was steady, stripped of its earlier frantic edge. "You keep talking about the mountain," Lin Xiao said, his gaze fixed on Artyom's face as if trying to dissect the man standing before him. "You speak as if you know exactly what is buried in those rocks." Artyom searched for the fearful, hesitant teenager he had met in the alley, but that person was gone. In his place stood someone hungry, someone who had tasted the possibility of power and was now weighing the cost. Lin Xiao gestured toward the distant, jagged silhouette of the peak. What is really on that mountain? The question was not a plea for help. It was a demand for the truth. Artyom felt the weight of his own lie pressing against his chest. He looked at Lin Xiao, seeing the raw skepticism etched into the boy's features. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Artyom knew that if he faltered now, the boy would walk away, and the timeline would be lost forever. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing his voice to remain flat and authoritative. "I know the future," he said, the words cutting through the tension. He stepped closer, locking his gaze with the boy's. "It is not a guess. It is a certainty." He gestured toward the horizon, where the peak loomed like a jagged tooth against the sky. "If you climb that mountain within 3 days, you will find something that will alter the course of your life. It is not an invitation. It is a destiny you cannot afford to ignore." Lin Xiao did not look away. The boy searched Artyom's face for a sign of madness, but found only a terrifying, unshakable conviction. The skepticism in Lin Xiao's eyes flickered, replaced by a dark, dangerous hunger. He stared at the mountain, then back at Artyom, his resolve hardening into a silent nod. The choice was made. The path was set. They were no longer two strangers. They were accomplices in an inevitable collapse. Artyom watched the boy, expecting a reaction of fear or perhaps a sudden withdrawal. Instead, he saw a transformation that chilled his blood. Lin Xiao stood motionless, but his posture had shifted. The slouch of a nervous teenager was gone, replaced by a rigid, predatory stillness. His eyes, previously clouded by doubt, now burned with a focused, singular intensity. Artyom tracked the way the boy's chest rose and fell, slow, rhythmic, and perfectly controlled. Lin Xiao's fingers twitched against his side, flexing as if gripping an invisible hilt. It was a terrifying sight. This was not the boy Artyom had found shivering in a dark alleyway. This was the spark of the legendary master, igniting years before it was ever meant to exist. The boy's lips parted slightly, his gaze drifting from Artyom to the distant summit. He took a sharp, jagged breath, tasting the air as if he could already smell the power waiting at the peak. There was no hesitation left in him, only a raw, hungry drive that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. Artyom realized with a jolt that he had not just pushed a boy toward a goal, he had unleashed a force he could no longer control. The ambition was real, and it was devastatingly sharp. Lin Xiao broke the silence with a dry, jagged laugh that sounded entirely wrong coming from his youthful throat. He shook his head, his gaze darting toward the looming silhouette of the Jade Peak. "You are completely insane," he muttered, his voice dropping to a low, rough rasp. He looked at Artyom, his eyes searching for any sign of a trick. He found none. The boy let out a long, shuddering breath and straightened his shoulders. But if that mountain holds the power you claim, then madness is the only logical choice. He stepped past Artyom, his boots crunching on the loose gravel of the alley. He did not wait for a response. He moved with a newfound jagged energy, his stride long and purposeful. Artyom watched him for a second, feeling the sudden absence of the boy's hesitation. The pact was sealed in the air between them, colder than the morning wind. Artyom followed, his own pulse quickening as the town receded. Every step toward the edge of the market was a step away from safety and into the unknown. They walked in silence, two figures moving against the flow of the crowd, eyes fixed only on the jagged, distant summit that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. The heavy gates of the town rattled behind them, the sound of iron meeting stone signaling a final departure. Artyom did not look back. The market noise, the shouts of merchants, the clatter of wooden wheels, the smell of roasting meat abruptly thinned as they pushed past the last row of low-slung houses. The road beneath their boots shifted from packed, stable clay to loose, uneven dirt riddled with sharp stones and tangled roots. Lin Xiao moved ahead, his pace unyielding, his head angled toward the distant, jagged ridge of the mountain. The transition was physical. The air grew colder, losing the warmth of human activity, turning sharp and metallic. A hawk screeched somewhere in the high canopy, a piercing sound that seemed to mock the silence they left behind. Artyom checked his surroundings. No familiar faces, no scripted events. The system remained dormant, its lack of warnings feeling more like a vacuum than a relief. Every landmark they passed was a deviation from the established sequence he had memorized. They were walking off the map, into a space where the manga offered no guidance. The forest ahead loomed like a wall of shadow, unyielding and indifferent to their presence. Lin Xiao stopped for a heartbeat, his hand resting briefly on a thick, moss-covered trunk before he pushed forward into the dark. The incline began suddenly, turning the path into a brutal series of switchbacks. Every step required a deliberate calculation of weight and balance. Artyom felt the burn in his calves within minutes, the loose shale beneath his boots sliding backward with each upward push. Lin Xiao was more agile, his breathing rhythmic and controlled, yet even he slowed when the trail narrowed into a jagged ledge. Halfway up the first ridge, a section of the path gave way. Artyom lunged for a protruding root, his fingers scraping raw against the grit as he hauled himself onto firmer ground. The air here was different, thinner, colder, and vibrating with a faint, static hum that made the hair on his arms stand up. They reached a stone marker half buried in vines, a symbol carved into the granite that signaled the boundary of the White Tiger sect. The temperature dropped sharply. The birdsong that had followed them up the mountain vanished, replaced by an absolute, suffocating stillness. Lin Xiao paused, his hand hovering near his waist, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. The forest no longer felt like wild land. It felt like a guarded cage. They were no longer just climbers. They were intruders in a place designed to crush the unauthorized. Artyom crested the ridge and dropped low, his palm flat against the cold, damp earth. Below them, the valley floor stretched out, obscured by patches of swirling mist. He squinted, his breath hitching in his throat. Through a break in the trees, a line of figures moved with mechanical precision along the primary trail. They were not wandering, they were sweeping the perimeter. The rhythmic clatter of metal on metal echoed up the canyon wall, sharp and unmistakable. Artyom grabbed Lin Xiao by the shoulder, shoving him down behind a jagged limestone outcrop. The boy gasped, his face pressing into the pine needles. Artyom did not let go. He kept his head down, watching as the patrol halted. One of the figures turned, a blade catching the dim light, and scanned the slope directly toward their position. Artyom held his breath until his lungs throbbed. The scent of ozone and stale incense drifted up on the wind, a sign of the sect's proximity. The patrol shifted, resumed their formation, and vanished into the fog. Artyom remained motionless for a full minute, his pulse hammering against the stone. This was not a story anymore. The threat was tangible, lethal, and looking for them. He realized then that every step forward was a gamble against an enemy that did not know the concept of mercy. Lin Xiao stopped so abruptly that Artyom nearly collided with him. The boy was staring at the ridge ahead, where a series of banners snapped in the high-altitude wind. They were unmistakable, marking the inner perimeter of the White Tiger sect. Lin Xiao's hands shook, his focus shattered by the sheer reality of the danger they were courting. He backed away, his heels digging into the loose gravel. "We are already dead," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the wind. Artyom moved into his line of sight, gripping the boy's arms with enough force to ground him. He looked directly into Lin Xiao's eyes, bypassing the fear to find the spark of ambition he had seen earlier. "You wanted to change everything," Artyom said, his voice hard and steady. "The artifact is 50 yards away. If you turn back now, you remain exactly who you are today. If you walk forward, you rewrite your future." Lin Xiao blinked, his gaze darting between the fluttering banners and the path ahead. His breathing remained ragged, but he stopped pulling away. He looked at the summit, then back at Artyom, his jaw tightening into a line of grim resolve. He took one step, then another, his gait stiff but moving again. The final stretch to the summit demanded every ounce of their remaining strength. They clawed their way over shifting shale, fingers raw and boots sliding on the loose incline. When they finally stood on the plateau, the world below vanished into a sea of clouds. Before them sat the cave, its entrance a jagged tear in the mountain face. As they approached, the atmosphere thickened. A low, rhythmic hum vibrated through the soles of their boots, rattling their teeth and settling deep in their chests. The air grew heavy, smelling of ionized static and ancient, trapped dust. Lin Xiao halted, his hand hovering inches from the rock wall as if repelled by an invisible force. The silence here was not empty. It was pressurized, pushing back against them with a weight that made every breath a conscious effort. Artyom watched the entrance, his skin crawling with the sensation of being observed by something that had waited centuries for this moment. There was no going back down the way they came without losing their nerve. The path behind them felt like a fading memory, while the dark void of the cave pulsated with a steady, golden light. They stood at the absolute edge of the unknown, where the barrier between their current reality and the dangerous future began to dissolve completely. Artyom kept his eyes on the cave entrance. The silence had reached a pitch that made his ears ring. It was not a natural quiet. It was the stillness of a held breath, waiting to be released. He looked at Lin Xiao, who was staring into the black interior with an intensity that bordered on hunger. The boy's hand reached out, fingers grazing the rough stone of the threshold. Artyom opened his mouth to speak, to offer one last warning, but the words died in his throat. The hum was getting louder now, a grinding sound deep within the mountain's roots. Every second they lingered here felt like an invitation for discovery. The wind had ceased entirely, leaving the summit trapped in a suffocating vacuum. Artyom felt the prickle of sweat on his neck, not from exertion, but from the sudden, sharp realization that they were being watched by the very air itself. He took a half step forward, ready to pull the boy back, but it was too late. Lin Xiao did not look back. He shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the stone floor, and stepped across the threshold. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, pulling him into the mountain's hollow belly. Artyom stood alone on the ledge for a heartbeat, then followed, leaving the world of light behind. Inside, the air was freezing and smelled of ozone. Artyom kept his hand against the wall, following the rhythm of the humming that now echoed off the jagged stone ceiling. Ahead, a faint, rhythmic throb pulsed in the dark. Lin Xiao moved forward, his footsteps heavy and hesitant. He reached the center of the cavern where a stone pedestal stood, carved with patterns that seemed to shift under Artyom's gaze. The artifact rested there, a jagged shard of metal that drank the surrounding light. Lin Xiao reached out, but the moment his fingers neared the surface, a spark of violet electricity snapped across the space, stinging his skin. He jerked back, breath hitching in his chest. Artyom stepped up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hum had become a roar, vibrating through the very bones of the mountain. Lin Xiao gritted his teeth, lunged forward, and seized the object with both hands. The reaction was instantaneous. A blinding, white-hot flare erupted from the center of the cave, obliterating the shadows and turning the cavern walls into translucent glass. The shockwave tore through the chamber, throwing dust and debris against the ceiling. It was a massive, uncontrolled release of forbidden energy, surging upward and outward, turning the entire mountain summit into a beacon visible for miles in every direction. The blinding white light collapsed into a dull, throbbing glow. Artyom blinked rapidly, his vision swimming with dark spots as the cavern returned to a semi-visible state. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating his skin in a fine gray powder. He braced himself, waiting for the mountain to groan or the ground to crack, but the violent shaking had stopped. Silence reclaimed the space, heavy and thick. Artyom took a ragged breath, the air tasting of burnt stone and ozone. He looked toward the pedestal. Lin Xiao was still standing there, arms braced, holding the metal shard against his chest. The boy was breathing hard, his shoulders rising and falling in deep, rhythmic heaves. Artyom pushed himself off the wall, his knees weak, and stepped into the center of the room. He reached out, touching the cold stone of the floor to confirm it was solid. It was. The artifact was secured. The dangerous energy surge had subsided into a steady, manageable hum. Artyom let out a long, shuddering exhale that echoed against the chamber walls. He looked at the boy, then back at the prize. Everything felt still. He felt the tension in his stomach dissolve, replaced by the hollow, foolish certainty that the worst was behind them. The timeline was holding. They had made it. Artyom moved to turn toward the cave exit, his boots crunching on the layer of fine debris covering the floor. He started to formulate a plan for their return, but the air in front of his eyes began to flicker. A thin, translucent line of blue light wavered, then expanded into a jagged, erratic frame. He swiped at the air, trying to dismiss the display, but the motion only seemed to accelerate the glitch. The familiar, cool tone of the interface was replaced by a harsh, distorted grinding noise that scraped against his eardrums. Suddenly, the blue light vanished, sucked into a singularity of deep, pulsing crimson. The entire cavern was bathed in a rhythmic, sickening scarlet hue that turned the cave walls into something resembling raw, exposed flesh. Artyom stumbled back, his heel catching on a stone, and he hit the wall hard. The system was no longer passive, it was screaming. A series of sharp, jarring bleeps echoed through the confined space, each one louder than the last. He tried to read the text, but the characters were vibrating, blurring into a chaotic mess of warning symbols. The light burned his retinas, a visual assault that felt like a physical blow to his skull. The peace he had felt only seconds ago was utterly obliterated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of terror that paralyzed his lungs. Artyom clawed at his eyes, but the crimson light seeped through his fingers, burning against his lids. He forced himself to look, his pupils dilating in the strobe-like wash of the interface. The chaotic symbols suddenly snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. A block of text hovered in the air, pulsing with the same rhythm as his frantic heartbeat. It read, "Timeline Deviation Level 2. He stared at the words, his brain refusing to process the gravity of the error. The air in the cave grew heavy, the temperature dropping until his breath hitched in thin, icy plumes. Every instinct he possessed screamed that he had made a fatal miscalculation. He leaned forward, hands trembling, and gripped the stone wall for support. His knuckles turned white against the jagged rock. The interface didn't just show the warning. It seemed to dissect his very presence in this world, highlighting the rift he had torn through the fabric of the story. The silence of the cave was now filled with the low, ominous thrum of the system's error logs. Artyom felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. He had tried to steer the plot, to force the narrative into a predictable shape, but the system was reporting a total failure of his influence. The screen flickered, the red light intensifying until it felt like it was tearing the air apart. He realized then that he was no longer a player in this game. He was a glitch waiting to be deleted. The crimson interface expanded, pushing aside the cavern shadows to display a secondary, scrolling list of errors. Artyom reached out, his fingers trembling as he tried to swipe through the text, but the hologram repelled his touch with a sharp, static snap. The system's voice, usually a neutral hum, sounded distorted and metallic as it spelled out the catastrophe. Artifact retrieval detected. Current timeline position. 2 years ahead of prescribed narrative schedule. Artyom felt his stomach turn. He had spent his entire journey relying on the manga as a map, believing it was his greatest advantage. Now, that map was the very thing dragging them toward an early grave. He had pushed Lin Xiao to the summit, thinking he was accelerating destiny, but he was actually dismantling the foundation of the world. The system blinked rapidly, its text rewriting itself in real time to reflect the damage. Knowledge. Corruption detected. User reliance on past data has triggered a causal cascade. Artyom looked at his hands, then at the glowing relic in Lin Xiao's grip. He had been so certain of the script that he failed to see the danger of changing a single line. He was not a savior. He was a blind architect, and the structure he had built was collapsing around them. The error message burned brighter, a final, lethal verdict of his own hubris. The crimson interface shifted again, the text dissolving into a single, pulsating line of code. White Tiger Sect has detected the energy surge. Artyom did not need the system to tell him what that meant. The air in the cave suddenly thinned, vibrating with a high-pitched frequency that set his teeth on edge. Outside, the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Then, a low rumble traveled through the stone floor, shaking the dust from the ceiling and making the rock beneath his feet feel thin and precarious. The White Tiger Sect was not coming for a conversation. They were coming to purge the anomaly. Artyom pressed his palms against the cold, damp cave wall, feeling the mountain groan under the weight of an incoming force he had no power to stop. His pulse thundered in his ears, louder than the shifting rock. He looked at the entrance, imagining the black banners and the cold, disciplined steel of the sect soldiers. They were no longer just characters in a story. They were a tidal wave, and he had placed himself directly in their path. The realization hit him like a physical impact, doubling him over as his lungs struggled to pull in the stagnant air. He was a beacon in the dark, and the hunters were already closing the distance. A new window bloomed in the center of the air, cold and unforgiving. A timer, 6 hours. It began its descent immediately, the digits burning in a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with Artyom's own frantic heart. 5 hours, 59 minutes, and 58 seconds. He lunged at the air, frantically swiping for a map, a hidden exit, or a way to neutralize the artifact's aura. The system flickered, its response immediate and brutal. No escape routes detected. Total annihilation probability, 99%. Artyom stumbled back, his boots grinding against the loose gravel of the cave floor. The silence outside was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of the coming storm. Every second that ticked away felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He looked at the timer, then at the cave entrance, his mind racing through every scenario he had read in the manga, only to find them all useless. The story had ended, and the reality of their survival was now measured in minutes. He could see the seconds bleeding away, a relentless countdown to an execution he had personally orchestrated. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the ticking clock seemed to deafen all other thought. There was no script left to follow, only the terrifying, unwritten expanse of the next 6 hours. Lin Xiao stood in the center of the chamber, his hands cupped around the artifact. It pulsed with a rhythmic, golden light that washed over the damp walls, casting long, dancing shadows. He looked down at the object, his face tight with a mix of disbelief and budding triumph. He had expected the artifact to be a burden, a test of his resolve. But it felt light, almost humming against his palms. He turned toward Artyom, a wide grin breaking across his features, clearly waiting for a word of validation or a map for the path ahead. He did not notice the way Artyom was staring past him, eyes locked onto the empty air where the red warning still burned. Artyom's hands were trembling, his fingers digging into his own forearms as if trying to hold his body together. The boy tilted his head, his smile faltering as he caught the frantic, hollow look in his companion's eyes. The golden light from the artifact flickered, momentarily casting the chamber in a sharp, clinical glare. Lin Xiao's grin vanished. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely a murmur in the vast, echoing silence. He looked at the artifact, then back at Artyom, sensing for the first time that the prize he held was not a key to a new life, but a target painted on his back. Artyom stopped breathing. The red text on the system interface didn't just flicker, it burned into his vision, branding the air with the inevitability of their end. He reached out, his hand shaking, and grabbed Lin Xiao's wrist, forcing the boy to lower the glowing artifact. The golden light dimmed, leaving them in the cavern's oppressive, damp shadow. Lin Xiao opened his mouth to ask what was wrong, but the words died in his throat when he saw the absolute lack of color in Artyom's face. Artyom's jaw locked, his teeth grinding together as he fought to find a coherent thought. There were no manga chapters left to reference. There were no plot armor protections. Every calculation he had made had collapsed into this singular, lethal error. He looked at the boy, then back at the red warning, and his voice broke, barely a thin, "We are in so much trouble." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, grounding him to the stone floor. He didn't look at the exit. He didn't look for a weapon. He just stared into the darkness, listening to the silence that preceded the arrival of the White Tiger sect. The countdown was no longer a number. It was the sound of their inevitable ending. They emerged from the cave, the mountain air biting and cold against their skin. The sun was a bruised purple smear on the horizon, bleeding the last of the daylight across the jagged peaks. Below them, the world stretched out into an endless, darkening expanse of forest and valley. Artyom did not look back at the cave. He scanned the horizon, his eyes tracing the paths that would soon be filled with the heavy, disciplined boots of the punitive squad. Lin Xiao stood beside him, his shoulders hunched, the weight of the artifact now a palpable burden rather than a prize. He followed Artyom's gaze, his own eyes widening as he realized how small they were and how much ground they had to cover before the light failed completely. No birds sang. The wind kicked up, howling through the stone crevices like a warning. They were two figures set against a landscape that had suddenly turned hostile. Artyom took a breath, his chest tight, and started down the narrow, treacherous path. Every step forward was a gamble against time. Behind them, the shadow of the mountain grew long and deep, swallowing the ground they had just left. The world was no longer a story to be read. It was a territory to be survived. They vanished into the descent, leaving the peak empty beneath the rising stars.